Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we are jumping into a single brewer, single style, but they're both a little bit different here. So for today, we're jumping into Kettle Sour Ales, and the brewer is the Brewing Projekt. They're based out of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. The first one, we've done a few in this same line of beers that they have, the Puff Tart series. This one's called Puff Tart XL. This is an Imperial Kettle Sour. Clocks in at 6.9% ABV, brewed with lemon, guava, and blueberry, which sounds awesome. Then moving on to number two, again, the Brewing Projekt. This one's called Purple Drank. This is also an Imperial Kettle Sour. This one a little lower ABV at 6.75%, and this one's been brewed with grape, blueberry, raspberry, and marshmallow. So both a little bit different, both Imperial Kettle Sours, same brewer, and they share the common kind of fruit theme, though different lineups of the fruit, and one has that marshmallow edition. So both of these sound awesome. All of the sours I've had from the Brewing Projekt have been great, and I'm very excited to jump into these today. So we're going to do just that. Starting with the Puff Tart XL, this one clocks in at 6.9% ABV. Okay, jumping right into the first beer of today's The Brewing Projekt Sour Beer Review. We have got Puff Tart XL. This is an Imperial Kettle Sour Ale, 6.9% ABV on this one. The Brewing Projekt is based in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. For this specific beer, it's been brewed with lemon, guava, and blueberry. And actually, it does have marshmallow as well. I caught that. It doesn't mention it on the front, but I did catch it on the back. So both beers do have marshmallow. That's actually awesome. And in fact, that kind of makes sense because that was one of the underlying themes of the other Puff Tart beers I've had by the brewer, and it does add this richness to it, almost like having lactose added into the beer, but without that added sweetness. It's just another layer. So in terms of label art, they keep a similar theme. They've got pictures of the fruit that are on there. It's very cartoon-like, and Puff, obviously, that's the reference to the marshmallow, so I should have known that. But nonetheless, nice looking label. So let's get this one cracked. Gently, gently. All right. And poured right in the glass. All right. I can tell you right away, aside from being a very lovely beer, this has a very, very pungent aroma. Very, very pungent indeed. I can smell the fruit just ripping out of this glass. All right. Gonna get a little bit of a dribble down the side there. I'll catch it. I'm trying not to analyze that little sip that I got, but let's hold this up. Yeah, visually, this is a very dark, kind of pinkish, orangish, reddish hue. It's a very, very pretty beer. Lemon, guava, and blueberry. That's about the color I'd expect it to be. It's got a little bit of color added from all of the fruit in there. As you would expect from a sour, it's pretty actively carbonated. It's got a lot of effervescence that's still rushing up, kind of a mix of small and medium bubbles there. This one did form a big, thick, creamy, foamy head on top. In general, on a sour, you don't really want a big, big head. So I am just going to let that naturally settle for a minute. I may have to break it down a little bit with my finger. If this were another beer style, I'd be elated, but not on a sour. A mouthful of sour foam, it's not great. So let's get right up on it and give it a proper sniff. Oh, wow. I cannot even begin to describe to you how amazing this beer smells. All of those fruit are just coming through in full force, and you can smell all of them and pick them out very clearly and individually. Lemon, guava, blueberry. And you absolutely do smell that marshmallow. There's a little bit of a marshmallowy and kind of vanilla kind of take and kick on top of this fruit. Now, you can smell that there's a little bit of a sour aroma to it, but it's not pungent like many, many different beer styles that are done with a sour back, obviously, or sour beer styles. You can smell it, but it doesn't smell abrasively sour is the best way I could put it. And honestly, this head has settled down enough. It's still got just a little bit floating on top, but I'll work my way through it. Let's just jump right in and see what this is about. Oh, Oh, that's tremendous. Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. My initial gut reaction at first sip of this beer was, this is easily one of the tastiest, most enjoyable sour beers I've ever had the pleasure of having on my palate. Honest to God, it is absolutely delicious. Absolutely delicious. It sounded awesome and it tastes awesome. These Puff Tart beers that the Brewing Projekt is doing, they are something seriously special. They're putting out new ones all the time. If you have a good local craft supplier that gets a decent stock of beers from around the country and sours, definitely seek some of these out. I mean, honestly, I remember the guava berry Puff Tart was the last one that I reviewed, and I had a similar reaction. I mean, I just absolutely loved it. The pungency with which these fruit come through and the balance of the flavors is just incredible. Truly, truly delicious. And yeah, just like I said on the aroma, the sour's there, but it's not oppressive. The same thing happens in the beer. You get a nice tang up front. It's got this nice sour and tart kick that does come through up front. And then after a few seconds, that intensity backs off. And really you're left with just this delicious palette of fruit and this underlying marshmallow sense to it. So there is very much a marshmallow flavor that translates directly into the glass. Okay, so I'm going to jump in for another sip here. Really think on the body and the mouthfeel and the finish and this flavor development. My initial reaction, very impressed. Just absolutely delicious. So another dive. Body on this beer is bigger than your average sour, but they correctly classified it as an Imperial Kettle sour. Sure, it's not Imperial with the same scope as, say, an Imperial IPA, but it's a sour. So I do think that nomenclature is accurate. It does have a bigger than average body. It's got a bit more breadth to it. I would say it's a solid rounded medium, maybe bordering into the medium heavy territory, but it's not what I would classify a heavy beer. It is for sour, but not comparative to other styles. In terms of mouthfeel, it's mostly flat, as you would expect from a sour. That's typically the case. It does have a good bit of carbonation you can feel as it just rests on the palate. There's just a slight bit of resistance when you move it around the palate, but it's not that much overall thick sensation than that of just water or a glass of juice. So it feels pretty much exactly where I expected, just with a bigger body than your average sour. In terms of how the flavors develop, what I got up front really just intensified on second sip. So you get that big burst of fruit as you're swishing around the mouth, and as soon as you swallow, it's just a massive kick of sour and tart that intensifies for a couple of seconds, backs off, and then the fruit just continue to bloom in intensity, and that underlying marshmallow and vanilla. It really does add this incredible depth to the beer. The beer on its own without the marshmallow would be absolutely fantastic. I think that the addition of the marshmallow really puts it over the top and into extra special category for me. It just adds this other layer of depth. And the balance, again, is so spot on that nothing's vying for attention, either in the aroma or in the flavors that come through. It's just absolutely delicious, incredibly well put together. It's just a freaking enjoyable sour beer. I mean, this is just delicious beer at its heart. In terms of how this finishes, true with most sours, it's not the longest finish in the world, but there was a little lingering marshmallow and mix of fruit that does stick around on the back of the palate a good bit longer than your average sour. It's not the sour or tart sensation that's pushing it out, it's really the flavor intensity. I would say it is above average, but it's not over the top. Overall, absolutely delicious beer. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, count my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's review. That is Purple Drank, also by the Brewing Projekt, and that one clocks in at 6.75% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's The Brewing Projekt Imperial Kettle Sour review, we have got Purple Drank. This one's a little lower ABV than the first at 6.75%. Again, Imperial Kettle Sour. This one brewed with grape, blackberry, raspberry, and yet again marshmallow. So aptly named Purple Drank. Very purple label here that just says drink. Nothing else to talk about, so let's get this cracked. gently. All right. And pour it right in the glass here. Okay. And as I'm pouring it, yeah, it does look a bit more purple, a little darker kind of hue to it than on the first beer. But it's not as deep purple as like a glass of Concord grape juice would be, for instance. So make no mistake. Yes, it does have purpley hues, but if I were looking at this visually, I would say it's a lot more orangey and ambery with kind of blue and reddish undertones than outright purple. But it's a very nice looking beer. Yet again, I can tell you this does have a very pronounced aroma. I could smell it immediately as I started to pour it in the glass. So I was a bit more gentle so the head didn't get as out of control this time. I think that helped the cause. Yet again, very active in terms of carbonation. It's probably a little hard to see in the glass, but super fine little champagne-like bubbles coming up from the bottom and off the sides. Let's get right up over it for a sniff. Oh, wow. That smells really, really nice. Not dissimilar to the first beer, though it does have a different kind of fruit aroma to it. Notably missing the lemon and the guava, and you can't detect that at all. It's not in there. You can easily smell the blackberry and the raspberry. The grape's kind of in the background. It's a lot more berry dominant on the aroma than the grape, but the grape does come through and it does actually smell rather like Concord grape juice to me, kind of just with berries on top as the dominant aroma here. And it's really kind of an even mix of blackberry and raspberry. They're both have their own distinct aromas and flavors, and they're both coming through very clearly in this glass. This one, you can pick up on that kind of sour and tart aroma, but it's not as pronounced as on the first beer. Same thing with the marshmallow in this one. I'm sure that it's in there, but I'm not really picking that up on the aroma. So that's what it smells like. It's very dominant berry. That's what's really coming through. So let's just jump right in and see what this one's about. Ooh. Distinctly different. Distinctly different. Now, something rather interesting is happening in the flavor profile in contrast to the aroma. So, just as with the last beer, when I first got it in my mouth and I started agitating around the palate, the fruit started to open up. As soon as I swallowed, the little burst of sour and tart came first, intensified. In this one, it was about half as intense and about half the length. So it ramped up over the course of about a second and a half, then immediately started to descend, and it was gone after about 3 seconds. And the fruit flavors really intensified. Even though it's berry dominant on the aroma, the flavor, it's a lot more 50-50, and it's really 50-25-25. It's grape, the most discernible, easy to pick out because raspberry and blackberry are awfully similar, but it's really 50-50 grape to berry flavors. So raspberry and blackberry are each making up about 25% of that berry flavor that's coming through in this beer. Also in contrast to the first one, the marshmallow is there. There's an element of it, to be certain, but it's not anywhere near as pronounced as in the other beer, the Tart XL. In this one, it's very much background. This one's a lot more fruit dominant, and it's a little less sour and tart intense. So it's got a lot fruitier quality to it. So for better or for worse, I like all kinds, and I like that it's distinctly different, even though same brewer, same style, and yeah, different fruit, but got more or less the same general vibe here, but it is a distinctly different beer drinking experience. So some people might not like it as well. Some would probably like it even more, particularly if you're not as big of a fan of super intense sours or you're just getting into them. This one's a lot more approachable. The sour and the tart intensity is not over the top. It's very nice, and it's very, very fruit dominant. Very tasty beer. I'm going to jump in for body, mouthfeel, flavor development, finish here. This one feels very similar to the first beer. The body is about the same. It's about a solid round medium, which is higher than your average sour, but 6.75% ABV feels about what I would expect. Mouthfeel, almost identical to the last beer. It feels mostly flat, A little bit of carbonation you can feel. You agitate around the palate, it does get a little bit thicker. There's a little bit of natural resistance, but it feels right for the style. So pretty much exactly what I expected. It's almost an identical body and mouthfeel to the first beer, which makes sense. Same style, same brewer, and very close in ABV. Flavor development on this one is quite a bit different though. You do have a lot more fruit intensity that comes through, a lot less sour, a lot less tart, and it does get a little more intense on the subsequent sip. But if anything, the sour and the tart stayed about the same, and the fruit intensity came out in this beer a bit more amplified on my subsequent sip here. In terms of what's happening with how the flavors develop on the back end and how it finish, it doesn't have a very long finish. The one thing I did notice about this one that I didn't get on the first is that there is a little bit of a dryness, a little bit of that classic kind of sour beer crispness to the end. It does have a slight brute-like finish. It does finish dry, and really what I'm left lingering on the back end is a nice mix of grape and berries. And it does extend maybe kind of average, but it's not super duper long, but it's very, very clean and very enjoyable. Overall, another really, really good beer here. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with the Brewing Project's Puff Tart XL. Again, both beers are Imperial Kettle sours. The Brewing Projekt is based in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. This one's 6.9% ABV, brewed with lemon, guava, blueberry, and marshmallow. So starting with the aroma on this was one of those classics, just super pungent sour beers. And yeah, it was plenty of sour and tart you could get on the nose, but the intensity of the fruit was what really blew me away. And you could very keenly detect that marshmallow. It smelled absolutely amazing. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste, I was as blown away by the flavor of this one as I was the aroma pungency. Packed full of flavor, nice big punch of tart and sour up front that kind of peaked and tailed off a little bit as the fruit intensified, and that marshmallow back, it added this almost silky vanilla quality to it and just big, bold, pungent flavors. I absolutely loved it. A great blend of ingredients and flavors here, and they pulled it off masterfully. 10 out of 10. For the body on this beer was bigger than your average sour. I would say overall it felt more or less medium, maybe kind of getting near the border of medium heavy, which is kind of uncommon for a sour. But again, this is an Imperial Kettle sour, almost 7%, 6.9% ABV. It's up there. So the body really for me was appropriate for the ABV range. I give it a 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, similar story. It felt very much like a classic sour. Sitting on the palate, and the classic effervescence you would expect to feel. But it did have a little bit more resistance than your average sour, but then again, the average sour isn't nearly 7% ABV. This one is. It's what I expected. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish. The finish on this beer was above average, to be certain, for a sour. Though honestly, it wasn't quite as long as some, nor quite as long as I anticipated. There was a lot of pungency of flavor here, but really, as nice of the kick of the sour tart came up front, it dissipated relatively quickly in the grand scheme of things, and that's normally what's going to kind of help extend the end on a sour beer. This one I thought really what pushed it in the above average direction was just the pungency of the fruit and the marshmallow flavors that came through, and it did definitely extend out longer than average. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the head and retention, this was the one category in the bunch where I was kind of like, nah, you know, it is what it is. Perhaps it was my pour, but this one really did form a very big, thick, foamy head. Did took quite a while to get out of the way, but it did eventually settle down. Sours, you don't really want a head full of sour foam. It's not what we're looking for here. You know, it did eventually get out of the way, but it took its time doing so. Gets a 3 out of 10. For the appearance, this was a lovely beer. All the fruit that went into the beer, you could see quite clearly that they added just their typical hues you would expect to see to this beer. It looked lovely. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance, Talked about this in flavor. Aside from just the overall pungency and how well the flavors worked together, the balance of them was exceptional. This had a nice big sour and tart kick up front, lasted several seconds, kind of peaked and dialed off while the fruit and the marshmallow flavor kind of came into their own. But the balance of it was great. I liked the balance of the sour and tart on this one. I liked the balance of all the different fruit. You could pick them all out individually. Same thing for the marshmallow. And that went not just for the aroma, or rather the flavor, but also in the aroma. It was very balanced. This whole beer was balanced. Perfect 10 out of 10 for me. Filling in the intangible, this is a very special sour beer. If you're a sour fan, this is one I would do anything in my power to get my hands on. I absolutely loved it. Subjectively, 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Okay, by and large, this beer swept almost every category. Notably, the finish could have been a little bit longer, but it was still above average. And the head and the retention. Okay, it did take a while to settle down, but in the grand scheme of things, once it does, you can enjoy the beer. You could have jumped in anyway if you don't mind a mouthful of sour beer foam. But I thought it would be extremely unfair to start bashing what this is based on one random category that in the grand scheme of things doesn't make that big of a deal. It is what it is. I got to rate how it came out. But as an example of the style, honestly, sour beers don't really get much better than this. It was truly delicious and a very special beer. I give it full points, 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on the Brewing Project's Puff Tart XL to a 90 out of 100. So a very high score indeed, and well above average. This is one, if you're a fan of sours, I would absolutely recommend you try to get your hands on this beer. Moving on to number 2, this is Purple Drank, a little bit lower ABV, 6.75, same style, Imperial Kettle Sour. This one brewed with grape, blackberry, raspberry, and also marshmallow. So starting with the aroma on this beer was nice, though it was noticeably not as pungent as on the first beer, and the balance of aromas was not quite as well done in this one, in my opinion, as this one. It smelled a lot more berry dominant than grape. There was kind of a mismatch of balance there, and I really didn't detect any of that marshmallow sense whatsoever. But it did smell nice, and certainly it was more pungent than your average sour beer. Docked 1 point here, it gets a 9 out of 10. For the taste was a similar experience to what I picked up in the aroma. Notably for me, the sour and tart intensity was maybe about 50% of what it was in the first beer and lasted about 50% of the length. And then all the fruit followed the same path. And they did intensify, and it really came out in the end being almost 50% grape and then 25-25 for that last 50% of each individual berry. And you could pick them out, and that was nice. What I did find was completely lacking in this one, though, was that marshmallow effect. I didn't pick it up anywhere at all in the flavor profile, which I was really craving. I think it would have added that extra depth to it, but it didn't come through for me. But again, absolutely delicious. I only docked 1 point. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the body on this one was basically the same story as the first beer. Same reason, it gets a 10 out of 10. The mouthfeel, the exact same story. It was the exact same experience. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was not as long as on the first, but it wasn't that different. And I kind of anticipated it based on what I experienced in the first beer. This one was far less sour, far less tart, and it didn't intensify as much nor last as long. And I kind of suspected that that would make the finish not quite as long. Though the fruit intensity was there, again, it was just slightly dialed back compared to the first one, and it was 1 point lower. This was high end of average. It gets a 6 out of 10. Head and retention. This one was much better. Could have been my pouring technique, but this one did a great job. It did form just a little bit of a head right as I was pouring it into the glass, and within a few seconds that was completely out of the way. That's what I want to see. Gets a 9 out of 10. For the appearance on this beer was lovely. Blackberry, grape, and raspberry more or less had the color I expected. Though they're going to call a beer Purple Drank, I thought that maybe perhaps there would be a little more sense of that purple hue from the fruit, all of which have purple characteristics in them. But still, it was lovely. Only docked 1 point. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the balance, Overall, I like the balance of beer, balance of flavors in this beer. But for me, I was missing that marshmallow, and I would have liked a lot more intensity of the sour and the tart up front. That being said, the rest of the balance of what it brought to the table was spot on. I like the balance of half grape and then half berries. Though, for my money, I would have, maybe a third, even thirds, a third grape, third blackberry, third raspberry. But they do share a lot of commonalities and flavor profiles, so, I'm not that picky. I liked what I tasted, and I could taste them all individually. I was just really wanting for that marshmallow to make an appearance and a little more intensity from the sour and tart. Above average, though. It gets an 8 out of 10. Feeling any intangible. Subjectively, I like this beer. Though, did I like it as well as the first? Not by a fairly big margin. Certainly, for a sour beer, this is a really, really nice example of a sour. And you don't get a lot of Imperial sours. So the fact that they're doing multiple of these, that's awesome. But subjectively, while I did like it, I didn't like it near the realm of this one. But I did think it was above average subjectively. It gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, is an example of the style. Overall, yet again, this beer did a very good job. It lost some points in a few categories, nothing too crazy. The finish was the biggest one here for me. But overall, yet again, for what they're doing, what they did with the beer, they executed it very, very well. I think just letting that marshmallow come through, a little more sour and tart, would have put it in the top tier for me. I only docked 1 point. It gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on the Brewing Project's Purple Drink to an 87 out of 100. So we're looking at a 90 and an 87. Both of them had different characteristics that were not quite as good as the other, but they were both excellent, excellent beers. If you're a fan of sours and you've never had or haven't had that many Imperials, these that the Brewing Projekt are putting out, they're doing a ton of lines of these kind of puff tart and the kind of style of these that they're doing, and they are absolutely delicious. And they're doing multiple different flavors and fruit blends. Well worth seeking if you're a fan of the style. I do highly recommend both beers. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.